a speaker series, but we also want to start with some updates for the group about what we as a network have been up to lately. So just to highlight a few of our activities. One thing that's really exciting to share is that we now have over 200 members. I think that Jorge's presentation for one of the APA groups brought in some additionally interested researchers and practitioners. So we're now above the 200 mark, which is quite cool. And really, I think something like 27 countries represented. So quite an international community. We also had a statement come out with ISSBD in their e-newsletter. So ISSBD has now shared their commitment to supporting research and practice on the impacts of climate change on human development. And we also have had two blogs recently published in the Child and Family blog. We shared links to that in one of our recent emails. The Cognition and Development special issue that is also coming out of a DevSCA initiative that is in production and due out in early 2026. And the special issue of the ISSBD Bulletin on climate change received a bunch of proposals from DevSCA members, and many of those have been invited to submit full articles. So there really has been quite a lot going on. The community has been very active, and it's exciting to see that we've kept up the momentum already a few years into our existence. Um, I'm now going to shift focus to the speaker series and introduce our speaker. Atia Bose is the National Director of Child Protection at Angan, a child protection not-for-profit based in India. For over decades, she has worked with marginalized populations in India and the United States to advance human rights with a focus on access to justice and opportunity. At Angan, Atya leads initiatives that engage government systems and legal frameworks to strengthen children's rights and protection. She champions a community-based prevention model that empowers non-experts to identify and prevent serious child harm before it occurs. Her guiding belief is that child protection must be everyone's business. I thought that was very well said. Her national advocacy and training efforts have focused on youth offending and rehabilitation, and on setting standards for care for children in institutional and alternative care settings. Her research and publications include studies of probation in India and due process within the juvenile justice system. Her policy advocacy has included serving on several government committees, such as the Ministry of Women and Child Development's Working Group for Child Rights. She led Angan's partnership with UNICEF in 2009 to develop the Standards of Care tool for children's institutions in the juvenile justice system. So I think we are clearly extremely lucky to have all of her experience and expertise with us today. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Atia, and please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I know it's very early in the morning for some of you. Um, and I really do feel very privileged to be able to share some of, what we're seeing and what we're learning about the impacts of climate change on vulnerable children. Can you share the presentation? So, we have a presentation that is split into two parts. The first part, I would like to just talk a little bit about the specifics of the work that we're doing and why what brought us to this space. And then in the second part, in the second half, I'll talk very briefly about a bigger report that we put out that, we'll share the link to the report. We'll maybe, if there's time, we'll share some of the findings of that report, and just share a link so that, folks can look at it in your own time and at leisure. So, I think from what Jenna said, you might be thinking, well, what in God's name does that have to do with climate change? But I think, important to say that for 20 years, my organization, Angan, we've worked to protect children who face dangerous and difficult circumstances. And when I talk about difficult circumstances, I mean specifically things like child marriage, trafficking, child labor, exploitation, and everyday violence. So while what that does is, I think what we've learned and what I feel like we deeply understand is the connection between family and community adversity and the threat that that has to children's safety and well-being. And I think we'll all agree that today one of the biggest threat multipliers and exacerbators of adversity that poor and marginalized people face is the climate crisis. And then what does that mean for their children is it means a profound increase in their risk of exploitation and violence. India is among the most climate vulnerable, you can, this thing, India is among the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. Go back to the first slide, yeah. India is among the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, ranking 7th on the Global Climate Risk Index. We're also 26th on the Children's Climate Risk Index, with children making up nearly 1/3 of the country's population. So for us, we believe that the climate emergency is not just an environmental crisis, which it is, and an economic challenge, but the way we look at it is that we think that the climate crisis is actually dismantling the very foundations of childhood, of safety, of care, of children's right to, be able to go to school, of belonging. So that's really what brings us to this space. And for us, it's a very urgent issue. And we're hell-bent on trying to build the evidence for more and more people to see the connections between the climate crisis and the protection issues that children face. And really, I think what we're advocating for is to say that child protection is climate adaptation, or climate adaptation is child protection, and the two should be seen very closely. So quite specifically, we come to this work. We work in a couple of very vulnerable districts in the country. We work in uh, but the one district that I want to talk about today is the one state I want to talk about today is the state of West Bengal. It's on the eastern coast of India. It's the Bay of Bengal. It is a very climate fragile state. It has 15 of the, almost half the state is exposed to extreme climate events. Cyclone frequency in the state has increased 5 times in the last 50 years. Not just is it a state that has extreme climate vulnerability, but the reason that we were working there initially was also because it has terrible indicators for child harm. It has, a high percentage of all girl brides. I think 15% of all girl brides in India are from West Bengal. It has a high number of trafficked children. What happens, and that's why we were working in the state. In 2019-20, in fact, while COVID was happening, the state was actually hit. Um, the state was actually hit by 2 cyclones back to back, 2019 and 2020. And I think what we saw at that time, the devastation that we saw at that time, is something that I don't think I don't think I'm ever going to be able to forget. Like, I will always have the voice of my team members ringing in my ears as they talked about what they saw when the cyclone hit. And actually, the thing that we saw over time was what happens and how things don't actually improve. So what did our baseline when we were trying to understand what exactly is it that happens? We conducted a very intense survey with 608 households across 2 districts where we work in the Sundarbans. So obviously, not surprising, you think about the sort of increase in financial vulnerability, people taking, 39 to 43% of people were resorting to taking loans, people having to sell assets. 31 to 54% of the people we spoke to talked about resorting to migration. Now, migration is a funny word, right? It's a word that we're all getting very used to. And I don't know about how it is where you are, but where we are, we've come to sort of accept migration as well. That's just how it is, and the word has sort of sanitized it sort of sanitized what the experience is. Migration is not calm and happy movement of people in an orderly way from one place to another place. Migration, when people are fleeing climate situation, or when there's forced sort of climate migration or forced because of economic conditions, there's rupture, right? And I think we kind of forget what that rupture is. That rupture means that people are losing all of the social networks that they built. They're losing all of the social capital that they built. Apart from losing home and heart and culture and language and belonging, they're also losing simple things like who's going to care for the old, the disabled, the children? Who's going to manage all of that? So that's the kind of rupture that happens when we talk about migration. And that's what people were talking about. Um, we asked when we started to ask more specific questions about children and what happens to children. So, as many as 20% of families talked about how they were forced to have their children drop out of school, send their children into labor, and marry their children off at a very young age. Uh, the findings, when we were looking at it for the exact impact on children. So obviously, like I think people spoke about irregularity in education, and what the slide shows you is the pink one is like what happens in the immediate aftermath, and what happens, 2 months post disaster. And then by the time we conducted the survey, we were looking at it was almost 2 years after, and people were still facing the consequences of it. So obviously, education, I think, is an obvious one to say, like, what is the impact on the disruption of education of children? Supervision is an interesting one. Because when you say supervision, I don't think people actually understand what it means. What we're talking about here is children not having adequate care. There being no adults in a child's life because of migration or because of changes in patterns of livelihood and where people have had to go. Child-headed households are on the increase. Now that in oftentimes mothers would be at home doing home-based work, but because of the changes, mothers are also now leaving the house. So now little girls are dropping out of school to look after younger siblings. And so you really have this sort of chronic situation of children looking after children. And, I'm going to leave it to your imagination to think about the protection issues that raises. It's not just an issue of sort of neglect, but it's also an issue of protection, not just for the little child who's being looked after, but also for the older child who's, alone bearing this responsibility. The other one, I think the one that was most shocking for us um, was hearing people talk about mental well-being. In India, at least in poor and working class families, people don't really talk about mental health. It's not something people talk about. And in 20 years of working, I've never actually, walked into a village or a urban slum and had people talk about like, oh, let's talk about my children's mental health. But it was astonishing to us. Like I remember all of the field surveyors who did the survey coming back and saying that it was astonishing to them to hear families talk about their children's distress, right? And I think that was a very, very difficult one, and I think is quite telling about people are writing right now about eco anxiety and about how kids are feeling, and it's something we saw. Kids talking about how they get very scared, how they have trouble sleeping, they feel restless. A lot of children talking about hopelessness. I've been doing child protection work for a long time, and it's hard work. Uh, at the best of times, it's hard work. But the one thing we've always relied on to get us through the day is the resilience of children. You know what I mean? And I think seeing that be vitiated, seeing young people not actually able to articulate and express hope, um, has actually been very, 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 very disturbing. I'll say that. Um, when we when we look at the sort of baseline community level findings, go back, please. Um, what we were trying to find out is like, okay, this is the situation that's going on, but are people actually able to see the link? Are people actually able to talk about it? So you're talking about your child's mental distress, but do you know where to go for help? And I think what we saw a lot is that, like almost 40% of households didn't know where to go, didn't know who to go and talk to if they thought their child was being harmed or at risk of harm. And only 6% of households said that anyone at a system level comes and asks them questions about their children's safety and well-being. Across the board, we saw a very low recognition of serious harms like trafficking, violence, and exploitation. We saw very little understanding of the link between what was happening, the sort of coping mechanisms that people were resorting to, and the exacerbation of child harm. When we spoke to adolescents, then it was 65 to 75% of adolescents said that they knew peers who were being affected by, who were being pushed into situations of child marriage or labor. And 23% of them said they faced the pressure themselves. And I just want to say, and many of you may know this, I mean, just from having kids yourself or being around children or whatever, like it's sometimes it's hard for kids to talk about when harm is happening to them. So this thing of saying it's not happening to me, it's happening to my friend, is something you also have to think about. So when people are saying 65 to 75% of adolescents say they know a peer who this is happening to, one has to think, well, some of these kids, it's happening to them as well. All of them talked about how they just accept, nearly 90% of them talked about how they just accept family decisions on early marriage because they just don't see any other way for themselves. 79% of adolescents talked about feeling lonely, which again was something that was very, very disturbing. And things like child marriage, things like child labor, being pulled out of school, large numbers of children just talk about it like it's completely normal. Like this is just how it is. There's scarcity, there's poverty, and this is what happens. At a governance level, we also talked to local government to see what was their understanding and how were they thinking about the situation. And speaking to local authorities who are charged with disaster response, of course, there's a great deal of understanding about infrastructure, relief, and all of that. But children's safety and rights, nothing. Nothing in the policy, nothing in the planning. Children are just sort of subsumed inside family, right? So you have a vulnerable family, and you assume the vulnerable family will just figure out how to manage the kid, just figure out in all of this chaos how to, care for children. Very, very few local governments could actually link climate hazard and child risk. Now, the reason I'm saying all of this is because the area where the area I'm talking about is an area that is a climate hazard area, right? So for us in a climate hazard area where there are repeated climate shocks, our thinking was that if everybody, children, families, communities, local government, no one is seeing the connection between the increasing climate shocks, what that's doing to family precarity and adversity, and then what measures families are then being forced to take, like pulling their children out of school, sending them into labor. If people are not seeing those links, then you're not actually going to be able to put any mechanisms in place in your adaptation strategies, in your mitigation strategies, in your disaster relief, disaster resilience and reduction plans, because you're just not thinking about it. You're just not seeing the link. So for us, a key thing became, so we so then we set to work, right? And the project that we're doing over there, we call it childproofing climate change. And really, the idea of it was the idea of it in these two districts where we work is working. Gram panchayats are village councils. They're the sort of most local level sort of government authority, and they're also the nodal authority for disaster relief in India. So what we set out to do was really to say, how do you embed child protection inside the thinking of families, communities, and local governments in order to actually sort of bring about some change in how people are going to think about it and work on it. Um, so essentially, like, it's just a question of saying, like, what we tried to do is really say, like, how do you bring order to this, right? So it was a three-layer thing. First, you have to get community, you have to mobilize communities to really be able to talk about what their experience of the climate shock is. So they talk a lot about the economic losses, about the livelihood losses. All of those are very important and they have to talk about it. But then you start to talk about, like, okay, what are the other losses? Because I think that was something that we were finding people were not being able to talk about. What are the other losses? And that's when you started to understand, and that's when they started to understand and talk about what was happening to their children. So really, I mean, I think we spent a year just talking. It seems like a waste of time, maybe, but we spent a year really just talking to people, hearing their experiences, and sort of helping them understand that there were things that were possible to do, and there were places that they could go to raise those issues. So it was about getting communities aware, about communities being able to gather evidence to be able to take somewhere. Here's what happened in this area when all these families had to migrate because of climate. Then this is what happened to their children. And now in this village cluster, there are 10 child-headed households who need some assistance from somebody. It's just like literally information like that. Um, and then creating an atmosphere where children are actually, because what happened, like, what did we realize? We said, in these situations, in climate hazard, when there's a disaster, when there's chaos and confusion, children are not seen and not heard, right? They're not seen and not heard in normal circumstances. They're definitely not seen and not heard. So how do you create mechanisms for children and adolescents to be seen and heard, for them to be able to feel safe to actually talk about that? So then it's actually the work of saying, so, okay, so you have communities who are able to talk about this, then you have openness and willingness for children and adolescents to also talk, to, be in peer safety networks where they start to think about these things, where they start to talk about it, uh, you know, and then they actually go in front of, the village council and actually present data about what their experiences are. So, and what that leads to is kind of like even young people saying, I will not accept child marriage. I do recognize what these things are and I will raise my voice about it. So that becomes a really important step for people to take. Then what happened is about how did the village councils start to listen, because that became really important. Um, and so, I think what happened was that when people raised something as an issue, and they raise it as a climate issue, then it became incumbent on village councils to also start to see it. They were hearing directly from children, they were hearing from communities, they themselves started to take action, they started to become more vocal about what happened. In 2023, when we did the study, there were very few village council members who could link climate shocks and child risks. And at the last kind of survey that we did in the middle of this year, that number had gone up to 90%. What does that mean? It means that now village councils have put child protection as an on their agenda. It's an agenda item for them. When they have their meetings, you know, issues of children are discussed. Children are called to the meeting to talk about what are the problems that they face. In there's a village council that, in fact, it's almost on the border with Bangladesh. And one of the village, the head man of the village council became a very active, very vocal supporter of children. And he got on he got on Facebook Live to prevent a marriage. There was a child marriage happening, and he was like, I'm gonna stop this." And he mobilized everyone, and he got on, and there was this whole Facebook Live kind of situation, which, like, these are actually it's a big deal to have village councils actually take these things on um, as issues that are of concern to them. And the reason, again, the reason I'm saying this is like, because maybe you're thinking like, okay, but this is child protection. Like, what does this have to do with climate? And I think that's the whole point that I want to make, is that the exacerbation of child harm is inextricably linked to what happens to families, what happens to marginalized and poor and vulnerable families in climate hazard zones. And so mechanisms for listening, hearing about the issue, have to be set up in quote unquote peacetime, so that when it is a crisis, you already have the wherewithal. You know where the vulnerability is. You know where that child is. You know what the situation is, so that you can respond in kind. When village councils started to understand that families are migrating and they're leaving their children behind, they instructed frontline workers to actually go and do supervision in the villages. Go see, where are the child-headed households? What is happening to them? Are they connected to food? Are they going to school? Do they need anything? Can they be linked to other adults in the community? So, just kind of setting up informal supervision mechanisms. These are all ways in which that, one hopes to move towards a place where, when people are understanding these linkages, then when you're thinking about, in my climate hazard district, where migration has now become a fact of life, maybe I have to think about creating community mechanisms for the supervision and care of children, so that when families migrate, children are not left alone, unattended. And not just children. I mean, I'm talking about children, but really, young children are also looking after the elderly. They're also looking after people with disabilities. So it's really about saying, that's what you have to be able to see. That's what you have to be able to focus on. So these are the ways in which you create mechanisms and ways for people to see, so that in the long term, they're able to create the structures that are needed to actually combat what families face in the aftermath of a disaster, and in the aftermath of increasing shocks and disasters. Because, we've come to a point in West Bengal, in these districts, where it doesn't take much. Like, I'm a family that that's faced. Someone described it where it's like, there can just be harder rain than we're used to, and that is almost too much for us to bear, because we lost the roof of our house, we lost this, we lost that, and now there's nothing. So, the tiniest climate shock can drive us into penury. Um, I'm not doing a very good job changing the slides, am I? I'm just babbling along. But I think, I mean, just, suffice to say, I think that what this work has done is that it has helped village councils set up make child safety sort of an agenda for themselves. It's something that they bring up in their meetings. It is now something 143 village councils have supervision mechanisms for children. 132, this is 132 of 150. Village councils now have structured ways to actually hear from adolescents, make sure that adolescents are heard. And we have a small commitment from about 62 of them, where they're actually setting up like sort of institutions, almost like where young people can actually come. We're calling them adolescent resilience and thrive centers, where young people can actually come to thrive, where they can learn, where they can share, where, these are the things that can happen. Um, Let's just keep going. So what does all of this do in terms of, child harm? I think, the slide speaks for itself. Uh, I think this is what, one has managed. One has managed to get 312, out of school children back to school, 371 irregular children back to school. More importantly, work to bring 585 of 587 children who were in exploitative child and hazardous child labor, get them out of child labor, prevent child marriages, and actually bring back children who ran away. This thing of children running away is actually something that we're seeing a lot of. And it's when you talk to children about it, they talk about, like I was talking earlier on about the hopelessness children face, and sometimes running away, um, girls accepting, ridiculous offers of marriage that are not really offers of marriage. They're just bait to get girls to go to God only knows what. But children are very susceptible. Like, I mean, that's really what we've been seeing is that the susceptibility of children to those kinds of offers. It's always there in poor and difficult districts, but we see the combination of that and I'm going to call it the loss of hope. Like I'm going to call it that because like that is really like when I'm there and when I'm talking to young people, that is very much how I experience it. And that combination is a pretty deadly combination. And kids and young people feel like the risk taking that one sees, like one always links young people and children with like risk taking. But this is a bit different, This is kind of like, I got to get out of here. And this is my own, I'll take any route. I'll do anything to just get out of here, to just change the circumstances of my life. And that's that's very scary. So that's it for the first part of my presentation about about the uh, about the work that we're doing in West Bengal. And I think, I'm not going to get into too many of the details. I would much rather open this up for some questions and hear from you. I think what I will say. And maybe you can share the link to the report. Is that good? We'll just share the link to the report and folks can read it. Um,
Yep.
because I think that the big thing that for us that we come away with is um, while we were doing this work in Bengal, we were also trying to read and research and understand the situation nationally and globally. Like, surely other places are also dealing with these things with children. And I think something we really realized is that inside the climate discourse, there really hasn't been that much attention paid to the specifics of what happens to vulnerable children. And so it's because of that we produced a report. You can just go to the next slide. We produced a report that's called the Climate Crisis and, the Vulnerable Child and the Climate Crisis. Um, and, it's a report that, it's got a lot of data. It's got a lot of data. It's India-specific data because India is what we know. It's got stories from India. But I'm going to hazard that this is not just the story of India. And even everything I've said about West Bengal and the work that we do there and the disruption that we see there, I don't think that I'm talking about it because that's what I know. But I think for young people and kids and families who are at the front line of the climate crisis, who are at the front line of where the shocks are happening, I think this is the story of life. And one hopes that the climate discourse will be able to, actually sit with the complexity and the extent of the loss that children and their families experience, because we're not seeing it yet. Everyone tells me that I should stop being such a doomsayer and I should actually be spreading, not talking about hopelessness. I hope that some of what I shared about the things that are possible and the things that do happen and that harm can be averted are some sort of silver lining to the thing. But I feel like this is a crowd that has the appetite to actually sit with the complexity, because I feel like if we don't spend the time with the extent of what is lost, then how are we ever going to fix for the problem? And I believe this is a community of people who are very passionate about looking for solutions and actually thinking about what is the loss, like what is the impact on human beings. And so, I just wanted to be an advocate for children and say, please, I do think we have to think of children as their own. They have very specific needs. And when you subsume children inside a family, what you're essentially doing is you're telling marginalized, poor people who are already struggling that you got to take this on as well. And invariably, that burden then falls on women. So, and then women pass that burden on to their adolescent daughters. So I think we have to understand that. And everyone always says, "Oh God, Athiya, does the climate discourse need another voice clamoring for attention?" And I say, yes, it does. It needs as many voices clamoring for attention. And I'm gonna I'm gonna stop speaking, and I'm gonna open this up and take any questions. And thank you very much for your patience and your time. Yeah, I close the thing.
Thank you so much for that emotionally challenging but also inspiring presentation. I know that Suman has prepared some questions, and I also see that Anne Maston has a question already. So maybe Anne, you can start. You raised your hand, and then we can
Okay.
pass it over to Suman.
Sure. This is actually a comment on this wonderful presentation. I'm totally impressed and struck by how beautifully what you're doing in India aligns with all the current evidence on how to build child resilience in the context of complex disasters like you've described. And I like the term forced displacement because it kind of captures, the situation a lot of these folks are in when there's a huge disaster. And these kinds of disasters are multi-system disasters, but your program is really described how, building the awareness of children's needs at multiple system levels is crucial. And that when you engage kids and give them a voice, kids who are old enough and adolescents in particular, you have kind of a dual effect. You both increase the awareness of the community, which is critical to the kids depend on families and communities and environments, but you also giving kids a voice is a very powerful intervention to build a sense of agency that people are listening, that, there's some kind of hope here. And it's, I think, a great example of how to counter the hopelessness that often comes with these multi-system and, kind of lingering disasters. A lot of the disasters you're describing don't go away immediately. They have, reverberate for a long time. So I just wanted to say I thought your program is wonderful, very strikingly aligned with everything we know about resilience from the literature, worldwide literature. And I think it's a wonderful example of what can be done. There's a lot of work to do, obviously, but I think it's a shining example. I'll stop
Oh,
there.
thank you. I'll be very honest, the thing about children's participation and, while obviously it's a principle of children's rights, but I remember when we first started doing the work, um, and it felt almost cruel. And I mean, we've had many internal conversations about how much do you talk to children and how much do you push children and ask them about their experience. Like, I don't know, we had these conversations about like, are you re-triggering something? Because kids talked about, we hear the siren when the desire, when the cyclone is going to come, and it takes us to the worst place, right? Like, so you're hearing the siren and then you're thinking of all the losses. And kids were talking about these things in very, very, moving ways. And like for us, there was this whole kind of conflict, like a moral kind of a conflict almost, in terms of like, well, how do you actually engage young people in these conversations? And there's kind of an existential dread, right? And how do you? So we have a lot of internal, back and forth and strife and conversations about like different people, feeling like, okay, what do we do? And I remember in the early days, we were like treading quite carefully around it as we were building the relationships, to be able to have some of these conversations. But yeah, it was pretty hectic, to say the least.
Thanks, Athya, for this insightful presentation. It's reminded me of my work with street children over the years. I'm more of a researcher, but, we did a lot of work ground on the streets with them. And I think Athya hasn't presented a lot because, they have they mobilize this ecosystem that is, accountable for child safety and well-being. So it's a very holistic approach that they kind of take in, and how they identify, train, and empower different stakeholders, those who are responsible, and bring them at a common platform to, co-create solutions. And, so it's like, bottom up approach, which is there. But I also was wondering, it's very tough because I worked with communities myself. So how do you, like a panchayat or village councils, they are basically, typically disaster response is what you expect. So what challenges did you face turning them into custodians of child safety and protection? Because, that's something it's generally taken as it's a family affair.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that wasn't an easy task. And, and how did you help them now that they feel they are responsible? How do you help them identify the risks or early harm indicators? I mean, there's so many questions here, in terms of we'd like to learn more about that. So,
So, I mean, obviously it's a work in progress, right? And I mean, I don't know when you ever get to the thing, but I think one thing is to say that um, creating, creating a demand, right? So you
mhm.
have communities now talking about it. So when communities are going to their village councils, they're also asking questions. They're also wanting to know. And I don't mean that in some kind of like necessarily. It's not even about like, oh, people are agitating and getting, but it's like there's more awareness about it. And there's a great power in children, in young people actually addressing their local officials, and I think there's a great deal of power in actually presenting hyperlocal data, and I think that's something that we help people present, because hyperlocal data. This is the place, this is the cluster where this is happening, where this child is experiencing this, where these many children are not going to school, or this child is at risk of getting married. When it's something so actionable, right? Because it's not some big number like, oh, all children are at risk or something. It's very actionable. And it's coming from your constituency, you know. Um, there's something powerful about that. Obviously, it doesn't always work, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's pushback, but I think that's what it takes. I think it's the combination of saying, how do you have multiple people talking about it, and multiple people talking about these issues with a view to saying, let's co-create solutions, like what you said, right? Like the idea being
Yeah.
problem solving, the idea not just being um, creating a ruckus and saying, I want, or whatever, but actually saying, okay, how do we do this? Because some things, your government and your local officials can do. Some things communities also have to be able to do, like systems of informal supervision and things like that are old historic ideas that, used to be there in the village. But those are the things that are ruptured. Like, how do you create that sense again to say, like, there are things that we can also do? And I think that's what it is. I think it's just about like facilitating conversations between unusual allies. And you like I'm just saying, like, you have to build these unusual sort of alliances, like to have young girls actually talk about, you know, trafficking or child marriage or sexual harassment on the streets to their village councils. It's almost shocking, it's almost shocking. And there's something about that shocking experience that I think sometimes pushes people to action. So let's see. I mean, that's one will just do what one has to do. But I think what it does is I think it builds trust and builds relationships among people, and I think it brings some issues that have been for too long in the shadows, brings it into the light and allows people to talk about it. And so I think that also frees people up, or, I think for families, for poor families who are being forced into situations where they're making terrible decisions for their children. After all, families are making those decisions, right? I'm marrying
Yeah.
off my daughter. I'm sending my son into labor. I'm sending my kid to a place where maybe it's a trafficking situation, but I'm just not going to ask too many questions, right? But when you take the burden of guilt off the family and say, this is not just your problem, this is all of our problem, I think that itself, I think there's relief in that for people, no? Like like the sense of shame and the sense of guilt that you must live with when you're making those decisions for your children. Those couldn't be very easy decisions that
Yeah.
people live with all the
Yeah.
time. So I think those things also count for something, Suman. I don't know. I'm sure you experienced that when you were working with street kids, because
Yeah.
a lot of the issues are the same.
Sim- So on gender inclusion, so I love the way you develop these leadership qualities in girls. I mean, you enhance that. But you see, culturally, our girls are also groomed to be very submissive. And in those cultures in Bengal, it'll be. So did you find any backlash if they stand up in front of the council? And so was there a backlash that the girls,
So you have
these,
to do things safely, right? Like, I think it's interesting, I'll tell you, because we have these ideas about these girls in West Bengal and all. And when we went, and everyone wants to be a social influencer. It's like, it's like, what do you want? Everyone is like, I want to be on Instagram being a social influencer. So, okay, that's very
Mhm.
interesting. So you're actually talking about kids who have a kind of an exposure, to all
Also,
kinds of things, and so there's a danger to that, obviously. But I think the thing about being able to tell children, build, like, who are your allies? When you have something to say, the first thing you have to do is, who are your allies? Take your allies with you. Don't do this just don't do this on your own. Like, understand the risks. So I think that work you have to do with folks all the time.
thank you. Yeah, I think there would be others, I'm sure.
I see a question from Pam in the chat. She said, "Excellent presentation. I'm interested in hearing if there were any challenges to bringing communities to mainstream this conversation in their interactions." So yeah, really creating a conversation. If people were uncomfortable with that, or what challenges you might have faced.
Yeah, and I think I tried to address it in the previous in my previous answer, which was really about, because when you're talking about child harm, families feel implicated, right? Like, families feel responsible because, you know, the child is harmed. What were you doing? Why did you not ask the question? Like, why was this? So because there is in India, child protection and child safety, these are the responsibility of families. We don't really have a child protective service or a child protective cadre from a prevention standpoint. Government systems kick in post harm. um, you know, but there's nothing from a sort of there's no like truancy officer coming and checking, and like there's none of that kind of stuff, right? So it is very much the family's responsibility, and it is very much, people do point like, oh, poor people, they're ignorant, they don't know what to do with their children. Why do they have so many children? They don't value education. Why are they sending them into labor? Or they're just lazy or whatever. There's a lot of different, biases and prejudices that folks live with, and that working class and poor families are used to hearing. So there is that, right? So when you're going and you're asking these questions, they're feeling put on the spot. So I think the first thing was to say, look, it's not just you. There are circumstances, there are structural barriers, there are issues that are beyond that are beyond you. I think it was super important for us to lead with that, to help people see the sort of systemic issue, so that some of the burden was taken off of them. I think that was one of the things. And then just sort of, knowing how to, like actually approaching communities and all through people that they trusted. I think just sort of old school community development, kind of like how do you do that kind of work? But I don't know if that answers the question. But yeah, I think a lot of it is that. And a lot of it is also, hey, just deal with my livelihood problem now. What are you talking about this? This will sort itself out. And it may not, but it's also like while someone's sorting your livelihood situation out, or whether they are or they aren't, like you also have to think about the choices you're making now. And if you have, like, if there are these 3 or 4 choices, then you have to think about what happens if plan A, what happens to my children? Plan B, what happens to my children? So there's some of that stuff also that you got to help folks be able to think about, right? Just see options.
Yes, Jen.
Thank you so much. This is really informative and incredible work. I had a question about one of your slides that talked about different kind of benefits of the program, and there was a category of children, irregular children. I wondered if you could talk about that category a little bit more, because I'm not quite sure what irregular children are, but it was also interesting because that was the category that looked like community members were stepping in more than the council, if I was interpreting that slide correctly. And I was wondering kind of what community members' role was there.
So
does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I'm sorry, now when you're saying it, I'm just like, yeah, what a god-awful slide that must have been, because that doesn't make any sense. But it's because, one understands children dropping out of school, right? And for us, we take the position that when a child is not in school, that is a child that's at harm, right? Because where is that child? That is a child who's unaccounted for. That is a child that nobody knows. So from a child protection standpoint, it's super important for me that a child is in school, just because the child is accounted. I mean, obviously, I believe that children should be educated, but there is an accounting for that child, right? Like I know where the child is. So you can talk about that. There's a very peculiar thing that happens in India, where children are enrolled in school. They go to school sometimes. The rest of the time, they're in the field, or they're at work, or they're managing the siblings, or whatever it is. So they kind of get lost in the data, because you're not really looking for that child, right? Because you assume that child is in school, but actually that child is in school 5 days of the month. The other days of the month, who knows where that child is? And so once communities started to see that, it became easier for them to also say, hey, why aren't you in school today? And like sort of just kind of figuring out ways, and then solving also for problems that make clusters of children sort of be irregular at different times. I don't know, simple thing, the water, child has to go to get water. So then school starts at 8, but the water, they have to go get water. So, can you get the school principal to say, it's okay, come late to school? So like stuff like that. Did that answer the question? Good point. I'm going to have to look at that slide.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I ask one more? Do we have
We
time?
just have a couple minutes left, so we'll keep it short.
So how are you evaluating your impact, Atya? I mean, is it a project dependent kind, a lot when we see of this kind of work. So what are your plans like in terms of sustainability when we talk about,
So, some of the findings that I talked about to you, those are from our internal evaluations and monitoring systems. What we are going to do, obviously, is we're going to do a sort of external evaluation of some aspects of the program that we feel are worthy of evaluation, because we think that they have value to maybe be institutionalized. Some of the things that the village council is doing, some of the measures that they're taking, some of the measures around what the importance of having mechanisms for children to be heard in a very regular sort of way. Some of those things we think are particularly valuable. So we will, of course, be doing an external evaluation of that. But I think also the point is we're also, as part of the work, we're also members of, sort of coalitions of other NGOs in West Bengal who are all interested in this particular sort of area. And we're together sort of trying to gather evidence to actually bring to, district magistrates or bring to whoever the powers that be inside, disaster risk reduction and disaster management, which is really like sort of the district magistrate's office, to say, look, this is the work that your village councils have been doing. This is the result of some of that work. This is the evidence that we're building around that, and with recommendations for what are potentially some things that they could incorporate into their plans going forward, mostly in terms of budget allocations, to be honest. But yeah, so I think so in terms of sustainability, like the idea is really like, how do you build the evidence to say these parts work, this is how they work, and how does it become something institutionalized? So for us as an organization, we're always very interested in how do you get communities to build evidence and bring that data to government authorities, so that from a sustainability standpoint, it is a conversation between the citizen and the state about what is the need. And so I think that's kind of the hope. And then also like hopefully to send, to be able to publish those findings, and like, along the whole east coast of India, I think these findings will be relevant. So, already like in Tamil Nadu, just that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Keep on keeping on.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Atya. I think that it is really a perfect example of the work that we as researchers are trying to support and contribute to and learn from. So it's really an honor to get your input, and I hope that it's inspired many people on the call and also who will watch the recording. And with that said, I want to notify everyone who's here that we have another speaker series meeting set up for, I believe, about 2 months from now, the 19th of February. So I hope we'll be able to see you all again then. But we're also looking for volunteers within our community to present in a speaker series themselves. So sharing your own research, or maybe you are working with colleagues or other students who you think have research that would be good to share among DevSCA members, or would like to practice their presentation also for an international conference. That's also an option. It could be a shorter presentation. It doesn't need to be the full hour-long session. So please send us an email, or I can put the DevSCA email in the chat. Actually, that's not necessary. Everyone gets our emails. That's how you know about the speaker series. But please just let us know if you're interested. We would be very excited to have more volunteers. And I just want to say thank you again to Atya for this fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much. It was a real privilege for me. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye all.